All right. How is everybody this morning? Are you well? Are you here? You know, however you are here today, we are glad that you're here, and it's so great that you've chosen to join us. My name's Josh, by the way, if I haven't met you yet. Hello, my name's Josh, and sometimes I wear yellow glasses, sometimes I wear no glasses, sometimes I wear black frame glasses, sometimes they're clear. Depends on the day, or if I'm even thinking about what glasses I'm wearing that day. How many of you spend time on your outfits? Anybody here? I'll tell you, I spend about 3 seconds. I look at my t-shirts or what's cleanest at the front of the line. Do they go with jeans? And that's my outfit of the day. So I'm not going to hashtag that, but that's about my reality every single day. But great to see you. And I hope that you've had a great week so far. We are in the second week of our series, as Christian said earlier. You've heard it said, and we're looking at 5 statements that Jesus makes as he uses this phrasing. You've heard it said, and these are a very popular message series. Some people call it the best sermon ever, the best preaching ever, however you want to package that. But what seems on the surface to be behavior modification actually is much different than that. And what Jesus wants to bring about in our lives actually is heart transformation, to change out what was old, to identify some of the things that might be holding us back, and to be able to unleash us to life and life more to the full. So the things that rob us of life, the things that rob us of joy, the things that rob us of truly what makes us feel alive and what connects us together, he wants to identify to help us grow and to change. And last week we talked about our hearts being like glasses that a waiter would carry through a restaurant. And many times a waiter can balance all the drinks until they bump into somebody, or until maybe they don't see a piece of furniture, right? And then something spills out. And in our life, our heart's the same. That there's things that are in our hearts that generally we can balance for a period of time, but eventually they're going to spill out. And this might be somebody that kind of rubs you the wrong way. This can be on the drive to work. And maybe in those instances, maybe for you, love and joy and kindness spills out of your life. But there might be some not so good things. And that's what we're talking about in this series, is how do we orient ourselves around the way of Jesus, that as we begin to look at the things of the heart, are the things that we can do so that what comes out or what spills out of our life is what we intend. Because sometimes when those things that we don't like all that much spill out of our life, we ask ourselves this question: where did that come from? I mean, it's got to be the other person. Anybody with me, right? It's got to be them. Like, it can't be me. Surely it can't be me. We ask us, well, where did that come from? And when we do a bit of an analysis within, we begin to realize that there's things in our life that, if we're not careful, can take really deep root. And they, like we said, they spill over onto others and the people often we care about most. And we've all experienced this from others. And that should be a cautionary tale to us that, you know what, maybe there's something there that we can work on, or maybe there's something there that God wants to work on in me. You see, we all have it. We've all experienced these moments. And if we're self-aware enough, right, we've seen it in ourselves. Because we know a truth. And whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, whether you have committed your life, whether you have, you can sing these songs with conviction yet or not, you know a truth in your life. And it's this: that what's in our hearts always comes out. And you can try and vow that it won't. You can try and stuff it all down like it won't come back up. You can try and pretend and hide like it doesn't exist. But the reality is that what's in us comes out. That whether it was intentional or unintentional, what we put into our life will eventually spill out. And this is particularly true in the area of relationships. Whether today you're currently married or not, maybe one day you're hoping to be, no one sits about their current relationships and thinks about their future relationships and thinks this question: how can I ruin my future relationships? Nobody does that, right? Nobody says, well, how can I cause these people pain? Nobody asks that question, right? You begin your marriage or you begin a relationship, or even when you think down the road of what you want your relationship to be, you think of that lifelong love story. The Notebook, right? We talked about it yesterday at the dinner table. I don't get that movie at all. Yeah, it was my wife booing me. I have endured suffering, and it is The Notebook. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so you never begin your marriage thinking that it's going to go in a negative direction, right? You want it to be a lifelong love story filled with deep joy and satisfaction. And yet, if we're not careful, there's things that we can let into our hearts that can destroy and fracture our relationships. You see, over the years, I've met people, or maybe you've met them as well, who've made decisions in their life, or relationships that have caused much pain, misery, and shame. People allow things in and over time grow complacent or learn to live with it or keep it hidden, thinking that it was no longer a problem, but it wasn't until it was too late. Or it wasn't until you got found out that you thought, this really grew to be something bad. And when everything hits, this is the question that people ask themselves. I mean, how did I get here? I mean, was it an overnight thing? Is it just circumstantial? I mean, how did I get here? And the reality of this series and what we're trying to unpack is you wish you could change some things in the past, but you can't. And it's hard to see in the present moment what's going on in our lives. And really, this is the reality of what Jesus is trying to get through with the Sermon on the Mount. He's trying to talk about key areas in our life and expose them, not so that we would feel shameful. Guilt is one thing, shame is another. That's another conversation for another day. But there's things he wants to expose in our life because there are warning signs that down the road, if we continue down a certain track, it can be devastating for us. And so the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount not only talk about current realities, but future ones as well. That if we allow things through the doors of our lives and our heart, and they start to take root, even when they begin to play in the tape of your mind about who you are or what you are, they can take us out, and they can take relationships out. And for this reason, I think today's topic is pertinent and vital for us to talk about. As we tackle one of the more difficult, you heard it said today, I believe that it's important and crucial to begin to examine ourselves, particularly in areas that we don't really want to talk about. As Jesus proceeds through his Sermon on the Mount, he gives a number of examples of the outworking of what wholeheartedness looks like. So when I devote myself to God, he's going to say, these are some of the outworkings of my life, that there's going to be blessing and that in certain areas that we're going to prosper. Now, that's not necessarily a guarantee of prosperous in the externally that I'm going to somehow be rich and healthy and all those things. There's no promise attached to that, as much as in our relationships, that if there's certain things that we do that, yes, we will prosper in our relationships, that they will be fruitful and they'll be deep and they'll be rich. And he talks about that in a number of different parts of our life. But it's all predicated on this idea of wholehearted obedience, because greatness in God's kingdom is measured by wholehearted obedience. It's not based on how much money you have in your bank account. It doesn't, all the things that you do right or wrong. It's your dedication and your devotion to God. And Jesus' concern is not to come up with and establish rules, but to transform our hearts and to change our hearts, to be aware of what's in us. He knows that for followers of Jesus, those who call themselves Christians, not just call themselves Christians, but truly followers of Jesus, who accept, yes, his death and his resurrection, as well as his call to daily surrender. What marks the Christian is that wholehearted obedience. And with this correspondence, there needs to be an inner disposition that's connected to an outward action. You see, the law of the heart, this is what we hear often, is to follow our hearts. As you've heard it said over and over. But it's not so much following your heart as much as a way that scans the motives of your heart, and in doing so leads those who choose to be led towards, and here's a big word, freedom. And so we find ourselves in Jesus' second "you've heard it said" statement. And everyone would agree that the next statement is true. And as he says it to a large crowd on a mountainside, so too today, it may be shocking. It may be challenging. It may be difficult. It may even be in that moment when you're preparing throughout the week, you wonder, how is this going to be received? That was me talking in third person. But Jesus wants to get to the heart of the matter. And so he begins with something that we would all agree, whether Christian or not. He would say, yes, this one, Jesus, I can get there. But again, he wants to expose the motive. He wants to scan our hearts to say, what's going on deeper within us? So he begins here. You've heard that it was said that you shall not commit adultery. And I think most people would say, yeah, that's bad. We don't want relationships to dissolve, right? We don't want to have in our life, we don't want to have moments where we see erosion in our relationships. And because we live in in the Western world based on Judeo-Christian values, many people in the West would say, yes, this is something that's bad. I want to spend just a moment on the front end of this verse, though, that you've heard that it was said. Now, what Jesus is referring to is the law of Moses. Yes, the 10 Commandments are a part of that. Maybe you've seen that Charleston Heston movie, right? He gets the 10 Commandments and then he brings them to the Israelites. And then there's a bunch of laws that end up in the Old Testament. You can read them in parts of the Old Testament where it's laws about how to live in society, Israel, with one another. Now, on top of that, there's more laws on top of that law. One of them is the Mishnah, which is 800 English pages of law on top of that law. And then there was also the Jerusalem Talmud, which was 12 volumes on top of those laws. And then there was the Babylonian Talmud, which was another 60 volumes on top of those 12 volumes, on top of those 800 English pages, on top of those laws. This is important because what we miss when we read this story is that Jesus is speaking to a cultural context. That your piety or the way that you approach God is based on how well you can keep law. And Jesus came to bring a new way. Jesus came to bring a new way that wasn't based on how good you can act. It wasn't based on how well you could clean yourself up. It was based on the grace of Jesus. That we receive grace not by the good things that we do, not by getting it all right, but rather by accepting who Jesus is. And it then doesn't have to be manufacturing or vowing to ourselves. It doesn't have to be shoving down. It doesn't have to be hiding. We can come to God and we can say, God, I need help. I need forgiveness. And God gives it. He extends it and he helps us. And this is important because Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to bring a new way in the world. That's why there's the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old covenant, new covenant. Old way in which God would connect with his people, new way for God to connect with his people. And the New Testament is a new way for us to approach God. And so today, as we continue on the message, you might see statements like this on the board, and you might be like, that has been my story. Or have I been on the other side of that story? And the good news is whatever side you have fallen in that story, and this is how scandalous the grace of Jesus is. It really is that forgiveness is given to all those who choose to receive it. It's not based on how good you've been or how bad you've been. It's based on the good work of Jesus. Now, there's definitely implications for our choices and there's consequences for our choices. You must understand that you've lived in the world. So it's not absolving us of consequence, but it is allowing us to be before God. And the thing that blocks us is typically shame. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But most of us would agree, yes, committing adultery, not so good. And so we can stand here and go, okay, well, I've never done that, so I guess it's not all that bad for me. But Jesus wants to take the conversation a little bit deeper, and probably deeper than we expect. And Jesus wants to raise the bar and raise a question about the heart. And this is what he says next, but I say to you, this is in contrast to you've heard it said. Now, there's a lot of people that can speak wisdom into our life. There was a whole set of laws, of Jewish laws that were spoken to and given to the Israelite people to make sure that they hit all these laws perfectly. And it was just, you can imagine how difficult and how challenging it was to fulfill every law. But Jesus says, but I say to you. And he's saying it from a position of authority and contrasting authority. Jesus is saying there's a new way in which to live. And what we need to understand is, what is the law trying to get at? What is it trying to expose in us? Is it just trying to repress, or is it trying to release towards freedom and expose those things in our life that we otherwise, we didn't commit murder like last week, right? So I guess there's no anger in me. No, anger can lead to deeper things. So too, he wants to go to the next section and talk about this. Yes, we might not have been committing adultery, but he's like, is there other things in us that might be there as well? But I say to you, this is what he says next. This is challenging, by the way. Just giving you a heads up. Whoever looks at a woman lustfully with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And it's at this moment where you go, wow. Right? Jesus is referencing those thoughts, not where we cherish somebody or not a passing glance, but those things that we dwell on. It's here where we all feel the same shock today as we would have felt 2,000 years ago in this crowd. We kind of look around, I hope it's not me, right? It's here that we do a quick check, and with good reason. It's here where the command of Jesus raises the bar and doesn't lower it. It's more inclusive, but not really inclusive in the way that we like. You see, this verse, although speaking directly to men, right, applies to both sides of the aisle. Men are more visual, and so this would make sense, but it's for both. For Jesus understands that this type of longing does something internally to us. It commoditizes another person. It strikes right at the heart and intention of God's creation. Can we just pull the verse down? So thank you. You can see, because God created men and women in his image. And what this means is that we're not all God, but we reflect who he is to the world around us. And in this, it uplifts, as children of God, it uplifts each person as a child of the Most High. Not something to be used and discarded. Not something to be obtained. Not something to consume, but rather that when God looks at his creation, he cherishes it. And so too, that's God's desire for us as human, to cherish each other, to love each other. And each person, as images of God, are meant to be cherished and treated as wonderfully made. And whether you believe in Jesus or not, I want you to know this today, that you are loved by God. You are cherished by him. And when it comes to our eyes, when we look at objects rather than subjects to be discovered, it corrupts something in us. When we consume rather than commune, it changes something in our hearts. And furthermore, using something or someone, it creates space and distance. And this is the real striking importance of this, that when we initially read this, we get shocked by. But I think this is so important. What we long for is to be known and to share ourselves with others, to have true intimacy and connection and community. And instead, we can opt at times for something counterfeit. And in turn, when we pursue these things with our eyes and our heart, they leave us empty. Which is the real thing we're trying to fill, is connection and intimacy, but it leaves us empty. And not just that, but it leaves us distant. And we feel this drawing away. When we think of Jesus' hope for people, life and life more abundantly, empty and distant it seems like a far cry from our intended purpose. If you boil down the whole New Testament ethic, it's this: that we're to love God and love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And what it does is this love that we're to extend to other people, consuming or just simply scrolling through, it does something in us. What it does is it forgets that command to love God and to love others. And I need to say this because in conversations, I don't know when, exactly how to package everything, and I'm going to do my best, but I think a lot of the conversations, if I can, around sexuality in the church have been around repression. We need to repress our desires, but the reality is that we need to reorder them. And that's what Jesus is getting at too. Is that Jesus isn't just talking about not violating something, but not putting things out of order. And when we get things out of order, we miss the beauty of it. And so he states that it's important for us to put him first and then to put others before ourselves. And if we're going to have really healthy relationships, it's an act of service. The greatest among us is the one who serves. And this is an opportunity, particularly when it comes to our relationships. We have an opportunity every single day to serve other people, to serve God, to love God, and to serve those around us. But when we just consume, it strikes at that. It's not about serving anymore. It's about being served. And so this is a caution. Jesus is saying, hey, there's a caution here. And it's not about shame. It's not about saying you're a terrible person because you did X, Y, and Z. God's not into the whole shame game. There's moments where we feel guilty, and that guilt should bring us towards God and say, you know what, there is something in my life. And so Jesus is going to talk about something next. Now, I just want to say this is hyperbole. Before we read this is hyperbole. It's supposed to be exaggerated for a reason, for us to understand the seriousness of what he's about to say. Look what he says next. If your right eye causes you to sin, now it could be both, but maybe there was a one-eyed guy. You never know, okay? Tear it out and throw it away. This is hyperbole, okay? For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown. And we talked about this word hell last week, Gehenna, which is a trash pile outside of Jerusalem that burned all day and all night. So this isn't necessarily talking about a literal eternal place, okay? This is talking about a place outside of Jerusalem that they would have brought things to the trash heap and thrown them out there. But what he is saying is careful what you put into your life because it will enter your heart. And this is a guarding statement. And there's a Greek word, it's the word natsar. It's the Greek word for guard, meaning to relentlessly defend and guard what matters most from danger. Recently, I've been, on Saturday afternoons, I've been going and watching my youngest son, Theo, play some basketball. Now, I love watching sports. It's one of my highlights of the week is watching sports. Also hanging out with Destiny and my kids. I'll just preface that, okay? Yeah, you're welcome, Des. Okay, so that is a priority for me, but hanging out with my kids is part of that. So I go and I hang out and I watch them play basketball. And one of the first couple weeks in, they are trying to learn how to play defense. And if you don't know anything about basketball, there's 5 players per team, okay? And whenever you play a sport, I don't care what sport it is, it's hockey, it's basketball, it's soccer, everyone does what? They run for the ball, right? Every kid runs for the ball, and it's like, right? Or it's the puck, or it's the basketball, right? They all go around. And it takes time to learn that, I can just defend one player, and if we all defend one player on the court, then we can cover everybody. And then the next level of that is zone defense, all right? And zone defense means when that person's not covered, maybe I need to cover 2 people, right? Because we don't want anyone to score. So I'm watching Theo learn how to guard somebody playing basketball. And it's hilarious. Yesterday, I'm sitting there and I'm like thinking about today's message and I'm watching them all guard each other. And This one guy gets the ball. Theo's right in front of him. And Theo's doing fantastic job, by the way. But he was told by his coach, only guard your check. So this guy's got a clear path to the basketball if Theo moves. Theo goes and runs to his check and gives the guy a clear path to the basketball. And I was like, because he was told to only guard his check, right? And then it got me thinking. We talk about guarding a lot of things in our culture. Like, you got to make sure you password all of your stuff, right? Every bank needs a password. You need to change it every 3 months. And if you don't save it in your keychain, you're in trouble, right? We guard our money. But what we don't learn is how to guard our hearts. And what I saw yesterday was a bunch of kids running around that have to learn how to guard somebody. And it's something we don't teach necessarily because it's something that seems so easy that, oh, we just need to be in love, or we just need to kind of do better. And we don't think, well, what are the parameters in my life that I need to put in place to guard? And so natsar is a word meaning to guard. And we can't always make sure we're perfect, right? That's not a possibility. But I do like Martin Luther's quote, and I think this is really good. He talks about a bird. Now, I might not be able to stop a bird from landing on my head. Like, there might be things that you see that you can't unsee, you can't stop. But I can keep him from building a nest there. And when it comes to this part of our life, I think that what I really want to get at, and as difficult as it is to teach this subject, as hard as it is to teach within the culture that we find ourselves in today, and the societal landscape and all the sexuality conversations that happen, I think it's important. What I really want to get at is how important it is to guard ourselves. Because if we allow things into our life and they spill out, if we're not careful, it can create distance in our relationship. Habits can be formed. This can be so destructive. But there's good news and there's hope. And so I want to talk about 4 ways that we can guard our hearts and our lives that I think are very practical, are helpful. They've been helpful for me. And they actually came from a book. These are not my ideas, but they come from a book by Steve Carter, The Thing Beneath the Thing. Our elder team read this a few years ago, and there's 4 ways that we can play, like guarding happens in basketball. There's 4 ways that we can play the game to guard our hearts from things that might want to enter in. And so I want to share those with you today and just unpack those a little bit. The first one is to play it back, and it's not what you think it is. Because we're really good at playing back, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. But you have to ask yourself the question, why? I mean, think about a moment over the last week. Let's use anger as an example, right? Because we talked about that last week. What was a moment that you got angry this week? What was going on in your life? So play back the scenario. Were you stressed at work? Are you financially stressed? Did you have that phone call with that family member where you're like, oh, heightened, right? Are you physically hungry? Like, did you eat this week? Are you sleeping? These can be triggers in our life that we think it's what's us. But if we're not careful and we don't take stock of what's happened in our life, if we don't play back what was happening around us and in us during these moments, we expose ourselves. And too often we play back just the thing. Oh, I did that, I did that, I did that, I did that. When in reality, we should be thinking through the situation. Was I hungry? Was I tired? Was I lonely that day? Was I stressed at work? Like, was I driving home and the person cut me off and I was already mad and I can't take it out on them because they have a whole car around them. And so I'm going to go home and I'm just going to take it out on somebody in my family. First person I find. And we don't think that, but that happens, right? So in all these weeks, when something spills out of our life that we go, oh, I got to take stock of that, play it back. Not just the moment, but what was happening in your life and around that situation. The second thing is to play it out. This is the next one. To look ahead at the upcoming week and imagine the same situation happens. Because typically we're creatures of habit, right? A lot of our lives are habits. So you're going to wake up at relatively the same time, eat kind of the same thing for breakfast, unless you're really adventurous every single day, right? And then you're going to drive to work, or you're going to drive your kids to school. You're going to watch that news cycle, and then you're going to go and you're going to check your phone. I almost said iPhone, but I don't want to be biased, And so you're going to check your phone at a certain time of day, and then you're going to have the same boss at work, and then you're going to have some of the same stuff as the day before. You might be in the same industry, which means you have the same situations quite often. You might be in the healthcare field. And guess what? People are sick all the time there, right? So these situations are stressful. So if you can play out your week ahead, that's good. And then do this. I'm going to play out my week, same situation. Maybe I'm alone at the end of the day and I'm tired and I'm stressed. What would be the best scenario for me to overcome? Maybe I leave my phone in a certain part of the house. Oh, but I'm an adult. Well, is it something that is got a hold that's getting into your heart? There's some things we have to do to rid it out of our lives, and maybe we need to play out that scenario. I don't know what it looks like for you, but play it out and say, how can I, this week, protect myself in that situation? The third thing, and we don't often think about this often, but is to play it smart. Now, this might not be obvious from the beginning, but I think it'll be helpful, is to play it smart means that throughout the week, there's going to be things that deplete us. One of the things that depletes me is long conversations. Shocker, I know. But long conversations, I feel really depleted after long meetings. I also feel depleted after cooking. Anybody else? No? Does that fuel you? Do you enjoy cooking? Okay, well, everyone's different. Okay, but to play it smart is to think, and that's a very practical way, but I want to just take it into the spiritual realm for just a moment if I can. But play it smart. What fuels you? You see, when we talk about prayer or Bible reading, we typically go check off, check, check. But really what those time with God are meant for is to refuel ourselves, is to actually replenish ourselves. That we believe that as we read the scriptures, that they speak to us and God speaks to us and he gives us direction or wisdom. That as we spend time in prayer, it will. And if you're struggling with that prayer life, it moves from obligation to necessity, because you recognize how important it is for God to lead us. And what those things do in our life, or a great devotional or small group, being involved in a group and reconnecting every week, what it does is it's playing it smart. It refuels you during the week. So if you're constantly depleted, you're constantly exposed to those things in our life that are going to spill out. Things like anger. We talked today about lust. These things spill out of our life, or we're drawn to them when we're stressed out. So what is going to fuel you this week? So play it back. What was the scenario this week that you want to change? Then play it out. What does the week ahead look like? Play it smart. What's going to refuel you this week? And then here's the last one, and this is a good one, is to just play it honest. Like, what is happening in you this week? So when something happens, like, let's just use driving in a car as an example. Somebody upsets you, and you go, all those feelings come up. What is happening in you? And to be honest with yourself, I'm angry at that driver. But what I'm really angry about is I can't seem to figure out a solution to my children. I feel stuck. Or you know what? I'm stressed because I feel like I'm in the same place as somebody, but we're not connecting, and I want to connect, and I feel this tension between us. Or you know what? I really thought that we'd be getting ahead and we didn't. And so it depletes us. And to be emotionally honest with yourself. Because if we're not honest with what's happening in our life, then we can't make the changes that we need to. And here's the really good news. And I believe this is the best news of all. I actually staked my whole career on this news. It was this: that even in our biggest moment of weakness and failure, that God's love doesn't change for you at all. That in that moment where we need to be honest about the things that are happening in our life, he doesn't turn away and go, oh, I'm so embarrassed. He sees us as Jesus sees us. Or he sees Jesus. when we invite him into our life. We are made perfect, that we're made new, that we have second chances. And yes, we don't want to cheapen the gift of grace by letting things go on and on and on. But too often, we don't believe enough in the grace of God that we can't be honest with others and certainly not honest with ourselves. So this week, play it back. What is the moment what is happening in that moment that you want to correct? Play it out. In the week ahead, what are you going to do in this moment when maybe you're alone, you feel isolated, you feel lonely, or maybe you feel like you feel hungry, or maybe you're stressed out from work. What are you going to do? And then to play it smart, right? Is when you think about these moments, what's going to refuel you, and then play it honest. Be honest with yourself. What is happening in you in that moment? And the more you can do these things, the more that you can find freedom, and you can guard your heart. One of the Old Testament characters that I really appreciate is David. Now, David does some honorable and not honorable things. At one point in his life, he lets his eyes wander too long and makes a decision that he wishes he could take back, but he can't. But one thing I find fascinating about the Bible is it doesn't shy away from those moments in the Old Testament, and it actually helps us to process them. And in Psalm 151, you can read it this week if you'd like. You can go through and read David in one of the lowest moments of his life, being confronted by a prophet in front of a lot of different people. And let's hope that's not our story, but he's confronted by all these people, and he's sitting there, and then he goes away. You can imagine all the things that are happening in his life, and he writes this psalm. And not just that, but that it ends up in the biblical text for us to read and for us to get inspiration from. And we read it last week, and we'll read it again this week. And it's an invitation to invite God into our life to work with us in these spaces. That we no longer have to be shameful. We no longer have to run and hide. We don't have to promise ourselves. We can just invite God into the situation to work with us. Here's some of the ways that we can guard ourselves this week. But it begins with a prayer, an invitation that God first extends to us, and then we extend back. God, I invite you to be part of my story. Because there's one thing I know about you, is that you guard what you value. Oh, so close. You guard what you value. We guard what we truly value. And God would say, you are so valuable that I gave you my best gift. I sent my son Jesus not because you had to have it all perfect, but because I love you and I sent him as a sacrifice for you. I value you. Now the thing is, will we put value on ourselves the way that God places value on us? And if we truly value our hearts, let's guard them well. So David, at the end of his life, prays this prayer. And you already saw it on the screen, so it's not a surprise. But create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. God, I invite you into my life, into those spaces I would rather not talk about or I'd rather not expose, but God, I bring them to you anyways, my whole self. But create in me, God, a pure heart and renew a steadfast spirit within me. And that's our prayer. That as you go into the week, the reason that I thought this is so important is rather than allow this to run in your life and see how it plays out, to begin to put guards in place now, to begin to invite God into our story, to say, God, in these spaces that maybe we don't really want to talk about, in those spaces that we might even be embarrassed about, God, we bring them to you. And would you do a work in me, create in me a pure heart and steadfastness in my life? Let's pray. God, I pray today. I pray that you encourage us. That we know that topics like this can be challenging and difficult. And at times can lead us to places where we want to just hide. But God, I know that you've got great news for us. That we don't have to hide, we can come to you. So today, God, in our vulnerability and in our lives, we just say, God, here we are. And I don't know what's happening in the lives of everybody in this room. But God, for some, it's anger. For others, it's what we talked about today, that we feel drawn to things that might be destructive in our life. And we've hidden it. We've maybe tried to bury it. God, you're asking for us to bring it to you. So God, in the most vulnerable place, we'd ask that you'd help us to guard our hearts. You'd help us to understand, God, that you're with us. And our prayer above it all is, God, would you create in us a pure heart, that what flows out of our life is love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, and self-control. And God, those other things that spill out of us, that you would help us to release them to you, and that you would work with us, God, that you've created in us a new heart for you. Wherever we are today, God, as we sing this next song, would you speak to us? Would you encourage us? If anything I said today, God, was not of you, would you correct it? But for that which was, would God, you help us move towards your truth and your freedom, we pray. Amen. Why don't you stand your feet right now? We're going to sing the blessing, which is a song of blessing over you today as you leave. So Conroy, why don't you lead us?